What if the way you've been breathing every single moment of your life, tens of thousands of times a day without ever thinking about it, has gradually shifted into a pattern that's working against your energy, your stress levels, and how efficiently oxygen actually reaches your brain and body after 50? Most people assume breathing is simply automatic, something the body handles perfectly on its own without any need for conscious attention. And in one sense, that's true. Your body will keep breathing regardless of whether you ever think about it. But the specific pattern of that breathing, how deeply you breathe, which muscles you use, and how efficiently that breath actually delivers oxygen where your body needs it, can shift gradually over decades in ways that reduce efficiency without ever fully stopping the basic function itself. So today we're going to walk through exactly how breathing patterns tend to change after 50, why this matters for oxygen delivery, energy, and stress specifically, and the exact technique to correct this pattern starting with your very next breath. Before we begin, remember this video is for education only. If you experience shortness of breath, chest pain, or persistent breathing difficulty, please speak with your doctor promptly, since these symptoms deserve direct medical evaluation rather than a general video alone. Now let's begin. Before going further, it's worth being honest about one important clarification, since headlines about oxygen and the brain can sometimes overstate what's actually happening physiologically. In a healthy adult without a lung or heart condition, blood oxygen saturation, meaning the percentage of oxygen actually carried in your blood, typically sits already at a very high level, generally around 97 to 100%, regardless of whether your breathing pattern is efficient or somewhat compromised. This means breathing technique doesn't work by dramatically increasing some deficient oxygen level in a healthy person, since there's very little room for that specific number to improve when it's already close to its natural ceiling. What breathing technique genuinely does influence, and this is where the real, evidence-supported benefit lies, involves how efficiently that oxygen-rich blood circulates, how effectively your body manages carbon dioxide alongside oxygen, and how your breathing pattern influences your nervous system's stress response, all of which carry genuine, meaningful relevance to how alert, calm, and energized you feel, even without a dramatic change in your baseline oxygen saturation number itself. Most people ask, how do I get more oxygen to my brain? But based on what we just discussed, the more accurate and genuinely useful question is, how do I breathe in a way that improves circulation efficiency, supports a calmer nervous system, and helps my body use the oxygen it already has more effectively? Because this reframing points toward genuinely well-supported, measurable benefits, rather than an oversimplified idea that breathing technique works like a dial you can simply turn up to add more oxygen to an already well-saturated system. Here is why breathing patterns genuinely do tend to shift after 50 specifically, even though the underlying oxygen saturation mechanism discussed above remains largely intact. The diaphragm, the primary muscle responsible for efficient, deep breathing, can gradually weaken somewhat with age, particularly in people who haven't specifically maintained core and respiratory muscle strength through regular activity. Postural changes discussed in other conversations, including forward head posture and a somewhat collapsed chest position that many people develop gradually over years of sitting, can mechanically restrict how fully your lungs are able to expand during each breath. And chronic stress, which tends to accumulate through various life transitions common after 50, is associated with a shift toward shallow, rapid chest breathing rather than the deeper, more efficient diaphragmatic breathing pattern your body relies on when relaxed and functioning optimally. Think of your breathing pattern like the difference between filling a large water bottle by tipping it fully sideways under a tap, allowing water to flow in steadily and completely fill the container, versus holding that same bottle nearly upright and only allowing a thin trickle to enter near the very top. Both approaches technically involve water entering the bottle, similar to how both shallow and deep breathing technically involve air entering your lungs. But one approach fills the container far more completely and efficiently than the other. Shallow, chest-dominant breathing works somewhat like that thin trickle, technically functional, but considerably less complete and efficient than the deeper, fuller breathing pattern your lungs and diaphragm are actually designed to use. Let's start with the first specific change that tends to happen in breathing patterns after 50, a shift from diaphragmatic breathing toward shallow chest breathing. Diaphragmatic breathing, sometimes called belly breathing, involves your diaphragm contracting downward with each inhale, causing your belly to expand outward, allowing your lungs to fill more completely from their lower, larger portions. Shallow chest breathing, by contrast, relies primarily on the smaller muscles between your ribs, producing a breath that fills primarily the upper portion of your lungs while leaving the larger lower lung capacity relatively underused with each breath. Many adults gradually shift toward the shallower pattern over years, often without ever noticing the transition, influenced by the postural changes, muscle weakening, and chronic stress patterns already discussed. This shallower pattern requires more breaths per minute to move the same total volume of air, meaning your breathing muscles are working somewhat less efficiently than they would with a fuller, diaphragmatic pattern, even though your blood oxygen saturation itself, as discussed earlier, typically remains largely unaffected in someone without an underlying lung condition. The second specific change involves the connection between breathing pattern and your autonomic nervous system, the system responsible for the balance between your body's stress response and its calmer, rest and digest state. Shallow, rapid chest breathing is closely associated with activation of your sympathetic nervous system, your body's fight-or-flight response, while slower, deeper diaphragmatic breathing is closely associated with activating your parasympathetic nervous system, the calmer counterpart responsible for relaxation and recovery. This connection works in both directions, meaning chronic stress can shift your breathing pattern toward shallow chest breathing, but the reverse is equally true, meaning consciously practicing deeper, slower diaphragmatic breathing can actually help shift your nervous system toward a calmer state, regardless of what initially caused the shallow breathing pattern in the first place. This bidirectional relationship is precisely why breathing technique offers genuine, evidence-supported benefit for stress and anxiety management, even though it doesn't work through the dramatic oxygen-boosting mechanism sometimes suggested by more sensationalized headlines. The third specific change involves carbon dioxide tolerance and its relationship to how efficiently oxygen is actually released from your blood into your tissues, a genuinely important, if somewhat counterintuitive, piece of respiratory physiology. Contrary to what many people assume, the process by which oxygen-carrying red blood cells release that oxygen into your tissues depends partly on adequate carbon dioxide levels in your blood, a relationship called the Bohr effect. Chronic shallow, rapid breathing tends to expel carbon dioxide somewhat more aggressively than necessary, which can paradoxically make it slightly more difficult for oxygen to be released efficiently from your blood into your tissues, including your brain, even when your overall blood oxygen saturation percentage remains normal. Slower, more controlled breathing, including deliberate practices that involve comfortable breath holds or extended exhales, can help support a more balanced carbon dioxide level, potentially improving this oxygen release efficiency at the tissue level, representing a more accurate, physiologically grounded explanation for why breathing technique can genuinely support better oxygen delivery to your brain and body, distinct from the oversimplified idea of simply adding more oxygen to your bloodstream. The fourth specific change involves circulation more broadly, since breathing pattern genuinely does influence blood flow through a mechanism called the respiratory pump. Deep, diaphragmatic breathing creates pressure changes within your chest and abdominal cavity that help support venous blood return, meaning blood flowing back toward your heart from throughout your body, functioning almost like a secondary pump working alongside your heart's own pumping action. Shallow breathing provides considerably less of this supportive pumping effect, meaning circulation efficiency, including blood flow relevant to brain function, may be somewhat less optimally supported by a chronically shallow breathing pattern compared to fuller, diaphragmatic breathing. The fifth specific change involves energy levels and mental clarity throughout the day, an area where many people notice genuine, subjective improvement when correcting shallow breathing patterns, even without necessarily understanding the specific underlying mechanisms already discussed. The combination of improved autonomic nervous system balance, better carbon dioxide and oxygen release efficiency at the tissue level, and improved circulation through the respiratory pump mechanism together contribute to many people reporting genuinely improved energy, focus, and mental clarity after consistently practicing deeper, more efficient breathing patterns, even though, as clarified at the start of this video, this improvement doesn't stem from a dramatic increase in blood oxygen saturation itself. Now let's talk about the sixth specific consideration, and this one involves posture directly, connecting to other conversations about walking mechanics and daily posture habits after 50. Forward head posture and rounded, collapsed shoulders, patterns discussed extensively in other conversations, mechanically restrict how fully your ribcage and lungs are able to expand during breathing, meaning postural correction and breathing pattern correction genuinely work together rather than as entirely separate, unrelated considerations. Someone who has already begun working on the postural adjustments discussed in other conversations may find that fuller, more efficient breathing becomes somewhat more accessible and natural as a direct result of that improved postural alignment, since the mechanical restriction that shallow posture creates is genuinely reduced once better alignment is established. Now let's talk about the seventh and final consideration, and this one involves consistency and practice specifically, since correcting a breathing pattern that's developed gradually over years or decades genuinely requires deliberate, repeated practice to become a new, automatic default, rather than something that changes permanently after a single session of conscious deep breathing. Your breathing pattern, like the walking and posture patterns discussed in other conversations, has become deeply automatic through decades of repetition, meaning meaningfully shifting this pattern toward a more efficient default requires consistent, deliberate practice over weeks and months, gradually retraining your nervous system's automatic breathing pattern, rather than expecting a single, conscious breathing exercise to produce a permanent, lasting change on its own. Now, before we go further, let's debunk a few common myths about breathing and oxygen specifically. For years, many people believed that breathing exercises work by dramatically increasing the amount of oxygen in their blood, an idea that, as clarified at the start of this video, doesn't accurately reflect how blood oxygen saturation actually functions in someone without an underlying lung condition. Some believe that faster, more frequent breathing must deliver more oxygen than slower breathing, when in reality slower, deeper breathing tends to be considerably more efficient at moving air and supporting healthy oxygen release at the tissue level than rapid, shallow breathing. Some believed that breathing pattern is entirely fixed and automatic, incapable of meaningful, conscious modification. And some believed that any benefit from breathing exercises must be purely psychological or placebo-related, without genuine physiological mechanism behind it. But when we look at the actual respiratory physiology involved, the picture becomes considerably more accurate and genuinely evidence-supported, even without needing to rely on the oversimplified oxygen-boosting framing suggested by more sensationalized content. The real questions are not simply, will this dramatically increase my blood oxygen level, or is breathing technique just a relaxation trick with no real physiological basis? The better questions are, is my breathing pattern primarily shallow and chest-dominant, or deep and diaphragmatic? Does my breathing pattern support a calmer, more balanced nervous system state, or does it tend to reinforce a stress response? Am I supporting healthy carbon dioxide levels that facilitate efficient oxygen release at the tissue level? And am I practicing consistently enough to genuinely retrain this deeply automatic pattern, rather than expecting a single session to produce lasting change? Now let's build a simple, practical technique you can use starting with your very next breath. First, place one hand on your chest and one hand on your belly, allowing you to directly feel which area moves more during your natural, unconscious breathing pattern, providing a genuine baseline understanding of your current default before attempting any conscious change. Second, practice consciously breathing in slowly through your nose, focusing on allowing your belly to expand outward, feeling the hand on your belly rise while the hand on your chest remains comparatively still, engaging your diaphragm directly rather than relying primarily on your chest muscles. Third, exhale slowly and fully through your nose or mouth, allowing your belly to fall back inward, making your exhale noticeably longer than your inhale, ideally aiming for an exhale roughly 1.5 to 2 times the length of your inhale, since a longer exhale specifically supports the parasympathetic nervous system activation discussed earlier. Fourth, practice this diaphragmatic breathing pattern consciously for 5 to 10 minutes once or twice daily, ideally at consistent times such as first thing in the morning and again in the evening, allowing this deliberate practice to gradually influence your unconscious, automatic breathing pattern throughout the rest of your day. Fifth, periodically check in with your breathing during regular daily activities, simply noticing whether you've unconsciously reverted to shallow chest breathing, and gently redirecting toward the deeper, diaphragmatic pattern whenever you notice this shift, building awareness gradually over time. Let's talk a bit more about a specific, slightly more advanced technique worth incorporating once the basic diaphragmatic pattern feels more natural, involving comfortable, brief breath holds specifically designed to support healthy carbon dioxide tolerance, connecting back to the Bohr effect discussed earlier. This involves, after a normal exhale, comfortably holding your breath for a few seconds, perhaps 5 to 10 seconds initially, before naturally resuming your breathing pattern, never forcing this hold to the point of genuine discomfort or urgency. Practice gradually and consistently over time. This specific technique may help improve your body's carbon dioxide tolerance, potentially supporting the more efficient oxygen release at the tissue level discussed earlier as one of the genuine, physiologically grounded mechanisms behind breathing techniques' real benefits. It's also worth mentioning the specific value of practicing diaphragmatic breathing while lying down initially, particularly for anyone who finds it genuinely difficult to distinguish between chest and belly movement while sitting or standing. Lying on your back with your knees gently bent, feet flat on the floor or bed, tends to make the sensation of diaphragmatic breathing considerably easier to feel and distinguish initially, since gravity assists somewhat differently in this position compared to sitting or standing, making this a genuinely useful starting position for anyone just beginning to practice this technique before gradually transferring the same awareness to sitting and standing positions as the pattern becomes more familiar. Let's talk briefly about nasal breathing specifically, since many people, particularly those who have developed a habit of mouth breathing, whether from nasal congestion, long-standing habit, or simply not having considered the distinction, may find that switching to consistent nasal breathing during both the conscious practice sessions and gradually throughout regular daily activities offers additional benefit beyond the diaphragmatic pattern already discussed. Nasal breathing naturally slows and filters incoming air, tends to encourage slower, more controlled breathing rates compared to mouth breathing, and produces nitric oxide within the nasal passages, a compound that plays a supporting role in blood vessel dilation and circulation, offering one additional, complementary mechanism alongside the diaphragmatic breathing pattern already discussed throughout this video. If you currently breathe primarily through your mouth, particularly during rest or light activity, gradually practicing nasal breathing specifically, alongside the diaphragmatic technique already covered, represents a reasonable additional refinement worth incorporating as your practice develops. It's also worth mentioning heart rate variability specifically, a measure reflecting the natural variation in time between individual heartbeats, which tends to be higher, meaning healthier and more adaptable, in people with well-balanced autonomic nervous system function. Consistent diaphragmatic breathing practice, particularly the specific ratio of exhale to inhale discussed earlier, has been associated in multiple studies with measurable improvements in heart rate variability over time, offering an objective, measurable marker of the nervous system balance benefits discussed throughout this video. For anyone with access to a fitness tracker or smartwatch that measures heart rate variability, tracking this specific metric over several weeks of consistent breathing practice can provide genuinely concrete, personal feedback about whether your practice is producing the nervous system benefits discussed today, offering a more objective measure than relying purely on subjective impressions of feeling calmer or more energized. But find that their breathing reverts to the shallow, chest-dominant pattern almost immediately once they return to their regular daily activities? This is an entirely normal, expected part of retraining any deeply automatic pattern, and it doesn't mean the practice isn't working or isn't worthwhile. Meaningful, lasting change in an automatic pattern like breathing typically requires weeks to months of consistent practice before the new pattern begins genuinely influencing your unconscious, default breathing throughout the day, rather than remaining confined only to dedicated practice sessions. Continuing consistent daily practice alongside periodic, brief check-ins with your breathing during regular activities throughout the day gradually extends the influence of this new pattern beyond just your dedicated practice time. Let's also briefly mention combining this breathing awareness with walking specifically, connecting back to other conversations about walking mechanics after 50. Since breathing efficiency directly affects the sensation of effort and fatigue during physical activity, bringing conscious attention to maintaining a fuller, more diaphragmatic breathing pattern during at least a portion of your regular walks, rather than only practicing this technique during dedicated stationary sessions, can help reinforce the pattern in a genuinely functional, real-world context, while potentially making your walks themselves feel somewhat less effortful as your breathing becomes more efficient throughout the activity. Such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or asthma, who wonder whether these breathing techniques are relevant or safe for their specific situation. Diaphragmatic breathing techniques are often specifically recommended and taught by pulmonary rehabilitation specialists for people managing these particular conditions, since the technique can genuinely help improve breathing efficiency and reduce the sensation of breathlessness for many people managing chronic lung conditions. However, given the specific, individualized nature of these conditions, working directly with your doctor or a pulmonary rehabilitation specialist to ensure any breathing technique is appropriately tailored to your specific diagnosis and current lung function represents a more appropriate approach than relying solely on general guidance intended for a broader audience without a specific diagnosed lung condition. Let's also briefly address how breathing technique connects to the paced breathing practice discussed in other conversations about blood pressure and morning routines, since these represent closely related, complementary practices rather than entirely separate techniques requiring separate, additional practice time. The diaphragmatic, belly breathing focus discussed throughout this video, combined with the longer exhale relative to inhale already mentioned, essentially represents the same underlying principle discussed in the context of blood pressure support, meaning consistent practice of this technique offers benefit across multiple areas of health simultaneously: nervous system balance, blood pressure support, and the oxygen delivery efficiency discussed specifically throughout today's video, rather than requiring entirely separate practices for each individual benefit. Now let's summarize everything in a simple way. Breathing patterns genuinely do tend to shift toward shallower, less efficient chest breathing after 50, influenced by diaphragm weakening, postural changes, and accumulated chronic stress, though it's important to understand that this shift doesn't primarily work by reducing your actual blood oxygen saturation level, which typically remains high and largely unaffected in someone without an underlying lung condition. Instead, the genuine, evidence-supported benefits of correcting this pattern through consistent diaphragmatic breathing practice involve improved autonomic nervous system balance supporting reduced stress, better carbon dioxide and oxygen release efficiency at the tissue level through the Bohr effect, improved circulation through the respiratory pump mechanism, and connections to postural alignment discussed in other conversations. Correcting this pattern requires consistent, deliberate practice, ideally 5 to 10 minutes once or twice daily, gradually extending toward more automatic, unconscious application throughout your regular daily activities over the course of weeks to months. But remember, the goal here isn't to achieve some dramatic, immediate boost in oxygen levels that a more sensationalized headline might suggest, but rather to genuinely, gradually retrain a deeply automatic pattern toward greater efficiency, supporting real, measurable benefits for your energy, stress levels, and overall physiological function. Benefits that are genuinely well supported by respiratory physiology, even without needing to overstate the specific mechanism involved. So right now, before continuing with the rest of your day, try just one round of this technique. Place a hand on your belly, breathe in slowly through your nose, allowing your belly to expand, and exhale slowly and fully, making that exhale noticeably longer than your inhale. Notice how this feels compared to your regular, unconscious breathing pattern, and consider building a brief, consistent practice session into your daily routine starting today. Now, I want to hear from you. When you checked your breathing pattern just now, did you notice more movement in your chest or your belly, and were you surprised by what you noticed? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story may help someone else watching this video become more aware of a pattern they've never consciously examined before. If this video helped you, please like, subscribe to Nutri, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more simple, practical health strategies for adults over 50. And next, watch our video on why you gain weight eating the same foods after 50, and the science behind it, because understanding how your body's fundamental automatic processes genuinely shift with age, whether in breathing or metabolism, gives you real, practical tools to work with those changes rather than feeling confused or discouraged by them.